It seems like every single generation has its own personal apocalypse. Whether it's ancient prophecies or, modern fears about technology, we are constantly being told that the end is just around the corner. But if that's really true, why are we all still here? Today, we're going to dig into why the world is always about to end and yet somehow never does. I love this quote because it hits the nail on the head, right? For centuries, you've had really sincere, really smart people who were absolutely certain the end was nigh, only to be proven wrong. It's this pattern that just repeats and repeats. So what is actually going on here? Okay, so to really get this, we have to look at the phenomenon itself. This pattern breaks down into a really predictable kind of recurring cycle. It starts with a bold prediction. Then there's this period of intense excitement and, frankly, fear. And then, when the day passes, well, you get a quiet little revision of the timeline. This pattern has the perfect name for this: eschatological Groundhog Day. It's this idea that every generation is convinced it's the last one. I mean, in the past, the signs might have been Roman emperors or shifting borders. Today you'll hear people pointing to AI or microchips or even QR codes as the dreaded mark of the beast. The technology is always changing, but that pattern of seeing the apocalypse in our own headlines, that stays exactly the same. To really get a feel for this pattern, the argument invites us on what it calls a museum tour of failed prophecies. And look, the point here isn't to make fun of anyone. It's to understand a very specific way of thinking that has, for almost 2,000 years, consistently produced the exact same result: disappointment. And believe me, this is not a modern problem. This pattern of disappointment runs through all of history. Back in the 2nd century, you had the Montanists, who were sure the New Jerusalem would land in what is now Turkey. Fast forward to 1844, you get William Miller's followers who had to face what they literally called the Great Disappointment. And I'm sure many of us remember Harold Camping's big prediction for 2011. The names and the dates keep changing, but the outcome? Always the same. And when you dig into the details, you see the same script playing out every time. You have the Anabaptists in the 16th century trying to literally force the New Jerusalem into existence. Or think about Hal Lindsey back in the 70s, who tied a biblical generation to the founding of Israel in 1948. The process is always the same. A prediction is made with total certainty, the date passes, and then the failure gets reinterpreted. Harold Camping was a master at this, claiming his failed prediction was actually a spiritual judgment, not a physical one. So this all begs a huge question. Why does this keep happening? Well, this isn't just a string of bad luck or bad guesses. It's the natural result of a specific way of reading the Bible, a kind of prophecy engine that's almost perfectly designed to churn out these kinds of predictions. The foundation of this whole engine is a framework called dispensationalism. Now, this is a system that got really popular in the 19th century. It basically chops up history into these distinct eras or dispensations. And the crucial part is that it draws this really sharp, bright line between God's plan for the nation of Israel and his plan for the church. And then, paired with dispensationalism is this interpretive lens called futurism. This view basically assumes that the really dramatic prophecies in the Bible, especially in the book of Revelation, weren't actually for the people who first read them. No, they're projected thousands of years into the future, our future, describing events that are supposedly just over the horizon. So this all leads to a process cleverly called newspaper exegesis, and it works like this. First, you see a headline, a war, a new piece of tech, a political treaty. Then you go hunting for a Bible verse, usually a really symbolic one you can pull out of its original context, that seems to match. You declare a prophetic convergence. And then, when nothing happens, well, the prophecy charts just get quietly updated, and the whole cycle starts all over again. Okay, so if that's the problem, what's the solution? Well, a pretty radical shift in perspective is suggested. What if we put these ancient texts back into their original 1st century world? The central argument here is a big one. What if many of the prophecies that people are applying to our world today were actually fulfilled almost 2,000 years ago during the catastrophic war between Rome and the Jewish people? Let's use a really famous example, the beast from the book of Revelation.
A futurist might look at that and see some future global leader, maybe using AI or microchips. But this other view, which is known as preterism, presents something completely different. It says the original audience, the people living in the first century, would have immediately recognized the beast as a symbol for the brutal, persecuting Roman Empire personified by emperors like Nero. It made sense to them. And the linchpin for this entire historical view is the year AD 70. This is the year the Roman army marched into Jerusalem and completely destroyed its temple. This devastating event wasn't just some historical tragedy, it was the very fulfillment of what Jesus warned about when he talked about the end of the age. Now that's key. Not the end of the planet, but the end of an entire world, the Old Covenant world of first-century Judaism. A huge piece of evidence comes down to one single Greek word, gene. When Jesus says in the Gospels, "This generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place," people have twisted themselves into knots trying to figure out what generation means. But the simple everyday meaning of gene is the group of people alive right then and there. In other words, Jesus was very likely telling his disciples that they, the people standing right in front of him, would live to see these prophecies fulfilled. Now, I know this all might sound like a pretty technical academic debate, right? But this has massive real-world consequences. These two different ways of reading prophecy create two fundamentally different ways of living your life. The alternative view being described, this optimistic one, is called postmillennialism. So instead of seeing world history as this downward spiral into chaos that needs a last-minute helicopter rescue, this view sees the gospel's influence gradually growing over time, leading to a great age of peace and justice before Christ's final return. From this perspective, history isn't collapsing, it's actually being redeemed. And this leads to two totally different mindsets. The first is what we can call the spectator. If you're convinced the world is about to end any minute, why would you think long-term? Why build for the future? It's that old saying, why polish the brass on a sinking ship? But the second mindset is the builder. If you believe that history is actually moving toward redemption, well, that encourages you to get involved. It means you value building families and businesses and schools, things that will last for generations, because you believe the ship isn't sinking at all. And that brings us to the final, really powerful question that remains. After 2,000 years of failed predictions and constantly revised charts, what if the goal was never about predicting the future in the first place, but about building it? What if the focus was never supposed to be on decoding some secret timeline, but on faithfully building a better world right here and right now?